Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room. This is so good. Look at this. This is so amazing because I can actually say welcome to my room and it's not bullshit. It's the truth. This is my room. So just in case you're not sure, I'm going to give you a little trip since it turns out that ever since my last video, or maybe it was not the last, but it was one of the last videos, I gave you a little tour, you remember? So rest assured, this tour is going to be nowhere near as nausea-inducing because it's going to be quite short. But I can give you a little tour of what my room actually looks like because we're back to my room. This has to be something that we celebrate. You know, it's not a small event. We're actually back to my room. We're back to France. Ireland was great, but you know, things. There's a great album by the Beatles, much regretted Beatles, George Harrison, who's the title of the album is All Things Must Pass. Now the excellent news is that some things pass and then come back, and I'm pretty sure that I'll be back to Ireland pretty soon. So here we have the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. Here we have Before the West Was West, a collection of essays on the American West. Believe it or not, I have an article in there. Here we have my edition of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, 7 volumes, which I'm currently reading, which is excellent. Here we have all my geeky little things, including a little award that I got at some point. First place in BA History when I was in university, and the National University of Ireland, so that's a source of pride. My Bed Without Hazelnut. And here, a number of books. Here we have Wuthering Heights, so nothing, you know. I'm a classical guy. I think I was described recently by talking with famous people as a conservative. So maybe this is what I need to embrace, you know. The fact that I am slow and conservative. It got me to reflect though about my style. I think it's the conservative description had to do not so much with my political convictions or even my intellectual convictions, but really with the format of the videos. Conservative maybe more in the sense that it is very simple. You know, I talk to a camera, take my time. Sometimes maybe take too much time, but as I'm doing right now. But as you can see, I'm happy to see you guys. I'm happy to see you, you know, back in my proper room, despite the absence of my beloved cat Hazelnut. That being said, this is not the purpose of this video, as you can well imagine. I was thinking recently that, you know, perhaps, what if we brought forward the hypothesis that most INFJs are mistyped? It's a radical interpretation. It's a radical hypothesis. It's bound to provoke some controversy. But as you might know, for the last while, I have been going through this phase, you know, Ireland probably didn't help that, phase of, I wouldn't say doubt about the MBTI model necessarily, obviously going through the phase of wanting to approach it qualitatively, as you might have seen in one of my videos, without quite being able to attain a higher level of detail in regard to the way in which I would want to approach this, because I just have so much philosophical work to do on the other hand, you know, this is what I dedicate the most time to. So, but it's just that recently I have maybe in this kind of cliche fashion, which would vindicate a lot of people who criticize MBTI, I have been just amazed by the diversity of people again, you know, and I've become almost a little bit uncomfortable about referring to these types, just because even when you interpret them as tendencies, they can easily come across as boxes. And what I realized is that to speak of someone as having a certain tendency is one thing, but from the moment that you use a type to refer to them, whether it be INTP or INFJ or whatever, despite your initial intention to reason in terms of tendencies, by the very act of symbolizing something as this final name, final code, you inadvertently over time reverted back into speaking of these types as categories of people with more or less rigid limits. And this is something that not only in terms of the model, but philosophically, in terms of my own philosophical thinking, like it's something that I'm trying to... I used to be fully someone who subscribed to categorical thinking, things are what they are. Now in my philosophical thinking, I have been talking for a long time about wanting to go beyond what I call essence, defining things in terms of limitation. But it's very, very much harder to go beyond simply just speaking about this concept or this theory and starting to illustrate it, express it, embrace it, live it existentially, in one's behavior, including in the way one talks. Now, I'm not saying that I will become incomprehensible by starting to speak a completely different language, but as part of these wider questionings, it's true that I think my view of the MBTI model, because I have a mind that is very synthetic. I tend to, whenever I develop a new way of approaching things, I apply to everything I think about, and so I'm starting to think that yes, like it's uncomfortable sometimes to talk about INFJs as if they were this one big category. And what's fascinating is that unlike the majority of the critics of MBTI who use this reason as one of their very primary objections or reasons for not taking the model too seriously, you hear it all the time. It boxes people in, and and I've always heard this critique and taken it very seriously. But at the same time, I try to, again, like I said earlier, suggest ways in which talking in terms of tendencies might be a good alternative. But even this concept of tendencies is fraught, I think, with problems, because tendencies toward what? Tendencies toward, a type. But then the concept of tendencies presupposes that of a rigid type. So you don't really get rid of the concept of type in that way. There are, I think, possibly alternatives or ways of dealing with these problems, but for me to actually take the time to start maybe not necessarily theorizing about MBTI, but talking about MBTI in that kind of way would require some study or analysis, and the bulk of that effort at the moment is taken up by other types of endeavors. Nevertheless, it is true that although I still very much identify as an INFJ, and I don't mean to say that this is a label that I reject, although I will probably always show a certain level of healthy cautiousness toward the label as a labeling. I still very much, like I said, I very much identify as an INFJ, but it is perhaps as a result of going through that phase of distance. What's happening is that I'm no longer in the same frame of mind that I was maybe for a year to a year and a half previous. Maybe from late 2017 until the beginning of 2019. And that frame of mind was one in which I had discovered, I had finally identified that I was an INFJ. And as a result, and I think a lot of you people can probably relate to this, I was partly, although I did not really say that to myself, I did not really consciously bring that to the front of my mind, I was trying to find ways of conforming that indeed I was an INFJ. So, it's that familiar mode of thinking in which we, sometimes people refer to as by confirmation bias. We tend to start also thinking in terms of like everything that we manifest as potentially confirming that we are a particular type, and a very great many people, maybe the majority of people online, are guilty of that to an extent. And this is part of their search for their type identification, and then their longing for the reassurance that comes with the identification of that type. So it speaks about, again, a certain need on the part of people for feeling like they belong, that they have a certain fixed identity. Perhaps also because the very idea of having a non-fixed identity, although it is probably closer to the truth, is harder to bear, I think, at a personal level. But because I'm a little bit past this mode of apprehending type and my type, I'm starting to take a step back and realize that really, like, a lot of the people that I see online, yeah, sure, I could see how we're similar in some ways, but for a lot of people, in a lot of ways, we're not that similar. And this leads me to wonder, does that suggest that there is an incredible variety and diversity of INFJs, such that it really becomes almost tenuous sometimes, spread thin, you know, what the essence, if we want to use that word, of the category, of the label, or the type INFJ means, or rather, is it possible that a lot of people who identify online as INFJs, perhaps more than for any other type, just because it's rare, because it has that kind of mystical dimension that people find fascinating or interesting or attractive, for different reasons, is the INFJ type the most likely to be misinterpreted, misappropriated, but to the extent that there could be potentially an unbelievable amount of people who are mistyped. Not to say, I'm honestly not in the least thinking of anyone in particular. I tend to be quite good-natured and assume that whoever says as INFJ is that. And I might not actually, again, at the individual level, I might not stop thinking that way, but I'm just trying to figure out, like, how come people who call themselves INFJs and consider themselves to be INFJs and who are online, how come they display this unbelievable diversity of temperaments and types? How come, and then to get into maybe a slightly more technical aspect of the topic, how come I cannot see necessarily NIUs that easily in them? How come I cannot really see TIUs? Perhaps FEUs, partly because it is an extroverted function, is one that is easier to see, but the thing is, sometimes FEUs is not enough to indicate that one is INFJ, although it is a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. But yeah, I think perhaps the absence of being able to see an NI clearly is one of the issues. TI also, but now there's two possibilities, of course, that relates to the relative invisibility of NI or TI in the case of INFJs online. I think the invisibility of TI might just come from the fact that as a tertiary function it is sometimes legitimately underdeveloped and so begs further developing. So that's a possibility. Of course, it could also suggest that the INFJ is really an INFP or an ENFP or any other such type. The invisibility of NI, could also come from the fact that NI is just so elusive and abstract and personal in itself, and that perhaps it is only insofar as someone is willing to put forward a lot of content that goes into the depth of their particular vision of something, rather than just being part of a community that exchanges messages and that discusses, not at a superficial level, but without unpacking a particular vision of theirs. Perhaps it is only in these contexts that NI can be seen with a certain amount of acuity and a certain amount of sharpness and vividness, and that it has not to do with it being actually absent. I'm just a little bit, I think for a while I was happy to privatively identify NIUs in terms of the seeming absence of NEUs. But I no longer want to do this. I no longer want to have this approach. I think that I would rather have a positive approach to the identification of NI and its manifestations, not just in terms of what we usually hear, not in terms of these generic definitions of the manifestation of NI, such as aha moments, feelings of déjà vu, the ability to connect like patterns that originally seem paradoxically separated or something like that, the convergence of it, all these manifestations of NI, they're quite abstract. How does NI manifest concretely? Of course, I have made a video on signs that you're an NI Dom, but I think that even this video does not really necessarily tackle NI head on. It tackles signs that one is an NI dom, outward signs, sure, which is already something, but really, how is NI manifested in a writing? How can you tell, okay, this person uses NI? This is something that, although it seems intuitively maybe obvious, is really not discussed enough. And maybe that is part of how, my doubts regarding, whether people are INFJs or not, that I go through sometimes, could be solved by the identification of this issue. But I will leave you. I leave you there. I leave it at that. It's already been a long and wordy video, and hopefully, hopefully this is also an indication that I will be returning to making videos more regularly from now on. Also because I have more time. Apart from the weekend, where I'll continue being quite social. Hopefully, I have more time during the week, so probably will make more videos from now on. See you soon, guys. I hope you're doing all very well.